So I want to talk about Plato. I always want to talk about Plato, and I wanted to try it in this live format. I'm not sure. I've never done this before, so it could go well, it could go poorly, but I just wanted to give it a shot. I've been listening to the Gorgias, and that's one of the books that is probably one of Plato's more famous books. It's one of the longer ones as well. And one of the themes is what the nature of rhetoric is. And it starts talking about rhetoric in a way that's pretty overt, right? Because he's talking to a guy named Gorgias. And Gorgias is a rhetorician. Gorgias is a guy who basically makes his living making speeches and convincing people of things. This is pretty common in the law courts in Athens. And back in the day, there was people whose job was just basically to go around convincing people of things, and it was particularly helpful for people who needed to get out of trouble with the law. And so Socrates goes and talks to this guy in the house of another guy named Callicles. Now, there's three characters that Socrates talks to in the Gorgias, and they're all very distinct. They're important when you realize which ones, what each one is kind of representing. So we have Callicles, who is the owner of the house. We have Gorgias, and we have Polus, and Polus is a student of Gorgias. So Gorgias is like kind of like the master. He's the guy who knows what he's talking about. He's the acclaimed rhetorician, and historically, Gorgias was also something similar. He was an actually famous guy, a famous rhetorician, and I'm not sure if Polus was historically his student or not. But Callicles was also a historical figure as well. And one of the things that's often said about Socrates, or rather said about Plato, is that he's against the sophists or against the rhetoricians. And the rhetoric in ancient Greece was something that was often dishonest. It was often, as we learn in this book, it was often something that people people used to get something that they probably shouldn't have gotten on their own. So rhetoric, the question of rhetoric and the question of whether or not it's something that Plato actually liked is something that we have to actually look at through all of the books that he wrote. So the Gorgias is one that talks about rhetoric. Another one is the Protagoras. Protagoras was another rhetorician. So hopefully we'll get into that in a little bit. But I just want to let you know that it's not as cut and dry as you'd think. There are some people who say that Plato is just always against the sophists. I think it's a little more nuanced than that. I think that Plato was against dishonesty, and a lot of times the sophists were kind of dishonest. But anyway, so we start out in the house of Callicles, and Plato is trying to discern what this guy's all about, what Gorgias is all about. I guess Socrates is trying to discern, and he has his friend ask, basically, what are you? What are you doing? To Gorgias, and Gorgias actually doesn't get to answer the question at first. His student Polus actually answers the question first, and Polus basically makes this statement that rhetoric is the greatest thing that ever happened. It's the most noble art. It's the best art. It's really great. And essentially, he never really answers the question. The question is, what is rhetoric, or what is Gorgias? He's a rhetorician, and Polus answers this question in a way that's very ornate, very flowing, very, I'm sure, beautiful, but not really an answer to the question. So Socrates then goes and tries to discern what is rhetoric, what is Gorgias doing, and that is the question. That's the question that basically follows through the whole thing. What is rhetoric? And we find out that rhetoric is not as noble as Gorgias or Polus actually end up suggesting, but we're not there yet. So basically, Socrates is trying to get at this question, and Gorgias is, frankly, honestly answering. He's not playing word games, really. In fact, you could say that Socrates is sort of the one that's being a little dishonest in here. But Gorgias is saying basically, my medium, the medium of my art is words. The objective of my art is persuasion, and it is persuasion about things like the law, things like what ought a city to do. But the problem with that issue, or rather, the problem with that definition of persuasion, is that there's a whole lot of arts that use words, and there's a whole lot of arts that persuade. Um, for instance, they use the example of math. So a mathematician might be persuading you that 2 plus 2 equals 4, and if you subtract one, that's 3. It's just quick math. So, but that's not the sort of persuasion that Gorgias is doing. That's not the sort of persuasion that a rhetorician is doing. So they have to basically refine that even more and say it's the sort of persuasion that persuades people in the courts of law or in the public assemblies. Okay, great. So Socrates is not buying it, though. In fact, Socrates has this suggestion that what rhetoric actually is a sham. It's basically a lie. It's a what's the exact word he used? I'm gonna try to find that. It's here somewhere. I think he used the word counterfeit. It's a counterfeit part of politics. So I think his exact words: rhetoric, according to my view, is the ghost or counterfeit of a part of politics. And then Paulus asks, is it a noble part or is it an ignoble part? And Socrates says it's ignoble. It is not a good part of politics. So he goes through and talks about there's 4 sort of good things for realities, and then there are 4 flatteries. There are four counterparts to those things that are not good. So we have gymnastics, medicine, legislation, and justice, I think. And each of those has their own counterfeit. So the idea of gymnastics in Plato is it's the idea of getting fit. Basically, it's not gymnastics like we know it. It's not like doing flips and stuff like that. It is it's more like getting big. It's more like working out. So in Greece, you'd have these people, going to these public gyms and working out just like people do today. And they obviously, in doing so, become more attractive people. And the sham of that, or like the opposite of that, is it's just dressing up. He calls it tiring, which is just kind of, putting on fancy clothes. And essentially, you could make yourself kind of look good by putting on fancy clothes, or you could just work out and make yourself look good by looking good. So the sham of gymnastic is basically dressing up, and then the sham of medicine is cookery. And the way they understand that is that medicine is what helps your body to get better if you're sick. Medicine is good. We like medicine. But cookery is sort of like the false entity of medicine. Now, remember, back in the day, medicine was largely had to do with the things that you eat. It largely had to do with ingesting things. I mean, they did some other stuff, but there was a lot of food regimens and stuff like that. So cookery basically comes along and says, I can, give you nice, tasty things, and you're going to like it a lot better than what the doctor gives. And then there's rhetoric and there's justice. So rhetoric is this sham of justice. So justice is a real thing. Justice is basically taking law and taking, truth and applying it to situations. And rhetoric is the sham of that. Rhetoric is where that sort of thing is not being done. In fact, it's the opposite. It's dishonesty. It's something happening that is against justice. So those are the four. And sophistry and legislation. That's the other one. But that's the other one that's in the Gorgias. And I think it's really interesting to think of those four things. Anyway, moving on, it talks probably the most important part of the entire book really is this question of, do we do what we will? And Socrates is arguing that most people don't do what they will, and by will that just means basically what they desire. Most people aren't doing the stuff that they actually want to do, and there's this whole interesting argument as to how he gets there. But the idea is basically that when you do something, you're essentially doing it so that you can get something else. For instance, you eat healthy so that you can be healthy. You don't necessarily eat spinach or broccoli or whatever, I don't know, stuff that's not necessarily tasty. You don't eat those things because you necessarily like them. Some people do, whatever. You don't exercise because you love exercising. Some people do, but most people exercise because they want to not die of a heart attack. They want to be healthy. So there are lots of things that you do, not because you necessarily want the thing, but because you want something that's kind of beyond that. So a lot of decisions that we make, we're shooting for something that is good. We're shooting for a good, and we're hoping that the thing that we're doing is going to help us achieve that good. Now, Socrates basically says that what you desire is the good, not necessarily the thing that you're doing. So if your objective is not met, if you're doing something, for instance, eating really healthy, and you're not healthy, you're not getting healthier, then you're not doing what you wanted to do. You wanted to get healthy. So this applies to happiness, right? A lot of the things that we want to do, we want to cause our own happiness. We want to be happy because of what we're doing. So when you fail at that, when you assess the situation, when you assess your world, make a decision so that you'll be happy, and fail, then you're actually not doing what you want. You're doing what you don't want. You want to be happy. You're making a decision so that you'll be happy, and you're failing. So he uses this to talk about tyrants. Tyrants are people that have a whole lot of power. You would think dictators. In a small sense, you could think of like a boss at a company, whatever, a boss, a leader. Socrates says that those people are not necessarily, even though they have all the power to choose to do whatever they want, they're not actually doing what they want, because what they want is to be happy. And the way they're going about it is not making them happy. So the idea that you always do what you want is something that's reserved for people who really think about it, who really basically, it's reserved for philosophers. It's reserved for people who are thoughtful to what's going on in their world. So the big question, or rather how we get to this question, is when Gorgias is talking to Socrates a little bit earlier. He's talking about what's he talking about? He's talking about justice. And Socrates asks Gorgias, he says, do you, if someone comes to you and is talking to you about what have you, rhetoric, wants to be your student, do you have to teach him to be just, or do you need him to already know how to be just before you can take him on as a student? And this question is like the big trap in the book, because Gorgias answers the question and says, yeah, basically, I can teach them to be just, no problem, that'd be fine. However, that becomes a problem because we know that a lot of these students of these people, they're not just, they're not good. They do bad things, and Gorgias says that he's going to teach them to be just. So if he's teaching them to be just, and also they come out of his tutelage and they kind of suck, then we have a problem, because that's basically his bad. That's Gorgias's bad, because he created a student, said he was going to teach him how to be just, and then failed to do that. So Socrates basically calls him out and says, you can't say that you're going to you're going to make someone just, right? You're going to teach them how to be just, and then unleash them on the world and have no have no responsibility for them. You have to basically take responsibility. And that's when Polus comes and talks about how Socrates is kind of cheating. He's kind of using basically using the common notion of a word and conflating it with a very specific use of that word. And we get to that later when we talk with Callicles. However, the big trap in the book, maybe I wouldn't call it necessarily the big trap, but definitely like a logical fallacy that really is one of the linchpins of the book, is where Socrates says that if you teach someone justice, they're going to be just. Now that's a real big question. That's a super important question, and it really unpacks a lot of what Plato thinks about knowledge and what he thinks about the virtues. Because his argument is that if someone knows what is just, then they're going to do what is just. And as we know, that's not always true. Now, Plato would have words for that. He'd have an explanation for the fact that some people know what is just and don't do it. But that is the big question, right? You can teach someone what it means to be just. You can teach someone justice in a very general sense, and they will not. They won't be just. They're not going to be good. So Plato, in response to that, would say that those people don't really know, right? Because he would say that you do what you think makes you happy. We were talking about this just a bit earlier. You do what you think will make you happy. And if you're choosing to do something that's not making you happy, it's because you're ignorant. It's because you don't know what's actually going to make you happy. So, for instance, a drug addict might say, I really think that doing meth is going to make me happy. And does a bunch of meth. And obviously isn't happy. Clear, that makes sense, right? You'd think someone like that probably wouldn't be happy, at least for the long term. And the problem is actually the ignorance of that person. That person thought that doing drugs would make them happy, and it didn't. So in order to discern what it is that makes you happy, you have to know what is conducive to happiness. That is to say, what will actually make you happy and what is not going to succeed at making you happy. So when Socrates says that you need to be just to be happy, or when he says that there's some precursor to happiness, he's saying that in a really real sense. Like, he's saying that you need to know what will make you happy, and then you need to make decisions that lead to that. So once you really know what's going to make you happy, for instance, like, you know that justice will make you happy. Once you know that for sure, then you're going to make those decisions. You're going to act justly when you know it's going to make you happy, because you're not going to do something that makes you unhappy, right? You might say, just like we said, doing drugs won't make you happy. If you really believe that doing meth will not make you happy, then there's nothing that's going to make you do meth. You know, if you believe that stabbing yourself in the eye is going to make you unhappy, there is nothing that you can do that will make you stab yourself in the eye. Um, you know, you think about that with people driving in cars. Like every day, people are driving on the road in a car, and it just takes kind of like one small motion of the wheel. You just kind of turn, like, I don't know, what is this, like 5 degrees, and all of a sudden you're in another lane. You smash into somebody, and everyone's dead. Like any time in any day, in the hundreds of people you cross on the road, that can happen. But the reality is that people don't do that. People don't make decisions like that because they're not conducive to happiness. It's not going to make you happy to smash into someone with a car. It's just not going to happen. So the idea is that if you know what makes you happy, then you're going to do those things. Plato's argument is that most people don't. Most people don't know what makes them happy. Therefore, they make choices, they do things that result in unhappiness. So, when Socrates says in the Gorgias that that if someone knows justice, they're going to be just. Well, thanks. Appreciate it. I'm glad to see that you're on here. It's kind of late for you, isn't it? So if you know what's going to make you just, then you're going to do it. It's that simple. There's not really any question. But the fact is, people don't really know, right? People don't know what's going to make them happy. Therefore, they're basically just shooting in the dark. They're trying some stuff, and it might work, it might not. In the case of the tyrant, in the case of the people that are not doing the right thing, they think that being a tyrant is going to make them happy. They think that putting people to death is going to make them happy, but it's just not. So that is, the first third of the Gorgias. I don't know how much further I can go right now, but I'm happy to try this a little more often. I've played with the idea of doing live. I'm not really sure how it works. Oh, hi, Bree. I'm not sure how it works with what with how this does this get published afterwards? I might be, I don't know. I like to edit my stuff, so I might just delete it after it goes up. But I wanted to just kind of talk about the first third of the Gorgias. I really appreciate this dialogue, and I'm listening to it right now at work. So I figured I'd just talk about it a little bit. We'll see. I don't know. It's the sort of thing that, I'd rather just kind of make a video that is a little more concise and helpful to people. But while I'm on, I appreciate being able to just talk. But as it comes to maybe kind of Plato in general, I guess, I really appreciate what it does for a modern reader. I think it's really important to think about how these sorts of ancient texts can really apply to a modern time, because what we have is a world that doesn't really quite understand the discussions that are happening in these books, And as we read ancient writings, as we read stuff like the Gorgias, stuff like the Republic, we are dealing with these issues from a perspective that is foreign to us. And I think that's really important because the problems that we have aren't the problems aren't the problems that they had, right? Like we're modernists. We have science, we have we think we figured everything out, and the problems that we're running into, we think are going to be answered by those things. Whereas these people, they had to kind of look inward, and maybe look around them to see what the answers to these questions were. And a lot of times they were much more thoughtful answers than we have. Some rhetorical thought in our conversations about rhetoric. Yeah, rhetoric is one of those words, I think, in my opinion, that it's largely pejorative today. We don't like the word rhetoric. In fact, if you're looking at the news, you see whenever a newscaster is saying that, like, oh, I don't like what they're saying, they're saying, oh, it's just rhetoric. It's just it's leftist rhetoric or right wing rhetoric, and the implication is, of course, that it's false, or that's lying, or it's deceitful. But I don't think that. Yeah, I don't think that necessarily has to be. I think that rhetoric is something that is just a clean packaged way of delivering some persuasion. And of course, if you're persuading someone to do good, then it's good, right? Like rhetoric is like a boxing glove or a fist or a gun. Like, guns can be bad, guns can be used to hurt people, but guns can also be used to, I don't know, shoot a deer and feed a family or something. So I think that one of the things we have to realize about words is that they're really good. We like them, but they can also be used to hurt people, and that's what Plato's arguing in the Gorgias, because it's sort of different back then. Rhetoric was something that was used in a very systematic way to influence people, and the influence was what they were paying for, right? You'd hire a rhetorician, you'd hire a guy to come into the courtroom and to say a really long speech, and everyone would be convinced, and everyone would say, oh wow, that's really cool. And then it didn't matter if it was true, it didn't matter if it was false. It was just rhetoric, it was just getting the job done. So Socrates had problems with that. And so when he's talking about rhetoric, he's more talking about the system, the way that the Athenians did things. And yeah, I don't know. I guess I'd like to do a really extensive review of this book, and honestly, it's more than I can do right now, but hopefully one day in the future I will. It'll be great. Yeah. Excuse me. So, I don't know. That's what I got. I will certainly consider doing this again. I appreciate it. I like it. Hopefully, maybe I'll have a little more planned for the next one. And see you later, Brie. And yeah, well, I guess we'll see. But now I'm gonna figure out exactly what happens to this when I finish, and if I can cut it up or what happens. I'm not really sure. So thank you for everyone who came through, and I'll talk to you soon.